BASMAN'S Best Games, 1976. Following my loss to Bill Hartston in the 1974 British Championship playoff, I decided to go into semi-retirement, since a strenuous civil service career could hardly be combined with equal exertions over the chessboard. 1976 was another quiet year, made even quieter by the rising volume of audio chess cassettes. I'd begun it in 1975, but had to wait around for about 9 months before I managed to persuade anyone else to do a cassette. And out came How I Got the Title by Tony Miles in the spring, which was followed by other and better cassettes by Keane, Steen, Harding, Hooper, and the like. All in all, audio chess grew from 2 cassettes to over 20 in that year, and I was even able to start up a library service in September. In between times of selling and recording all these cassettes, I played a few tournament games, mostly weekend events in the London area, and some club matches. The average grade of my opponents was around 200, which meant that life wasn't too hard, and I came second in 2 of the weekend events and first in a couple of others. All this is very good for the grading, which I expect to shoot up next year, and providing I don't play in any tough international tournaments, I should be fairly near the GM norm. In the early tournaments of the year, I was in a rather cautious mood, and preferred to build things up gradually. Here is a game against young Peter Sowray from the Surrey tournament of April 1976. I'm white, so if you have your boards ready, we can go off. White played pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, and black pawn to d6, white pawn to c3, black knight to f6, and white bishop to e2. This is a patent BASMAN'S system, analyzed on the cassette White Opening, and designed to allow White to build up a classical pawn center, whilst continuing his development on the king's side. Actually, I transposed the move, since bishop to e2 is supposed to come before pawn to c3, but the difference isn't too vital. One of the points of the move, which countless practices have fallen into since I released the cassette, is that if black plays knight takes e4, white goes queen to a4 check and wins a piece. And the other point is that if black plays knight to qb3, which is quite natural, then white can go pawn to d4. Then when black plays knight takes e4, white will push on pawn to d5, black knight on c6 moves away, and once again queen to a4 check picks up the knight on e4. At any rate, Sowray seemed to know all this, and therefore he chose to delay the development of his knight to c6. He continued black pawn to g6, that's after white's bishop to e2. White castle kingside, black bishop to g7, white rook to e1, and black castles. Now, black really is threatening to capture on e4, but white is just in time to defend it with bishop to f1, which he played. And this retains the option of expanding in the center with pawn to d4 later on. So black played knight to c6, preparing, in case white plays pawn to d4, to play bishop to g4. Well, he'd exchange pawns first and then play bishop to g4. And this is a motive which often occurs in the reload pairs. So in order to stop this bishop to g4 maneuver, white played pawn to h3 here. At this point, if black had wished to follow BASMAN versus Suttles, which occurred 2 years back, he might have gone pawn to e5. But as I mentioned on the cassette white opening, white hasn't got to go pawn to d4 in reply, which would anyway open the diagonal of the black bishop on g7. Instead of that, white could play bishop to b5 to restrain black from playing pawn to d5 himself. Or he might go pawn to d3 and follow up by white bishop to d2, planning an eventual pawn to queen's knight 4. In our actual game, if you haven't moved the pieces, if you have, then return them as in diagram S1 in the booklet. Sowray chose an alternative. He played knight to e5. You may wish to switch off here and consider this move. I was a bit nonplussed by this move and didn't feel like defending my centre from all sides, which would occur if I played pawn to d4, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, black captures on d4, white recaptures, then black goes queen to b6. So I rejected that continuation. I also couldn't see anything clear in capturing on e5, so instead of all this I played pawn to d3. Black chose pawn to b6, and white knight on b1 to d2. Black knight takes on f3 check, white knight takes on f3, black bishop to b7, and white bishop to d2. I haven't commented on these last few moves and alternatives because the differences are much too fine. Now, after white's bishop to d2, black played pawn to c4, which isn't all that dangerous actually. White replied with queen to c1, and that's clearly taking control of the diagonal leading to black's to the h6 square. Well, after queen c1, black played pawn takes on d3, white bishop takes on d3, and black knight to d7, white bishop to h6, black knight to c5, white bishop to c2, black rook to c8. Well, switch off here again and have a look at the position. It seems that though black is actively placed, he's got all his pieces on good-looking squares, he isn't doing anything to white. e4 is securely guarded, and black's c-file pressure comes up against a brick wall at c3. If white therefore is able to maintain his e4 square, he's got the better prospects. Now in this position white chose queen to f4. Little double-edged, but I was probably hoping to swing it over to h4 if I could. Well, black replied immediately with pawn to e5, hitting the white queen. This queen retreats to e3. There are all sorts of underlying threats to white's e-pawn in this position, but they don't work. As black can't play pawn to d5, because he loses king pawn of course, he has a long-term worry looming up. That's the weakness of his d-pawn. You might also be wondering about the bishops on h6 and g7, and why nobody exchanges them yet. Well, it's all a matter of fighting for every inch of ground. Black didn't want to retreat his bishop to h8, and he didn't want to bring white's queen to h6 by capturing on that square. At the same time, white didn't want to capture on g7 because that would bring black's king to g7, and that would mean that black could defend his black squares from that position. In the actual game, after white's queen to e3, black moved knight to e6, fishing around a bit. White's next move was no problem. Rook a1 to d1, and black moved queen to c7. Here is a good time, I think, to switch off and take a stock of the position. I generally have a lot of switch-offs in my cassette, which can be annoying, but I find that if you don't switch off, the positions tend to flit by like moving landscapes on a train journey. Well, in this position, white chose rook to d2. It was quite important which rook he played up. He obviously wants to double on the queen file, but rook e2 wasn't quite the right move, though I can't remember why at the moment. I think it was something like the black queen comes in on c4 at a decisive point. After white's rook to d2, black played rook f8 to d8. White chose not to double at this point. He played bishop to b3. I think after this, black is on the road to a very bad position, since white is steadily bringing the position into one where the d file has got great importance. Black played knight to c5, hitting the e pawn. White blocked with bishop in to d5. Black bishop takes on d5. White rook takes on d5. Now this is one of the reasons why you haven't seen two rooks on the d file yet. One of them is needed to guard the e pawn in case black tries something like bishop takes h6, queen takes bishop, and then black knight takes on e4. Black thought here for a little while and came up with a maneuver full of long-term hope. He moved knight to a4. That hits the b pawn. White moved rook to e2. And black pawn to a6. This is the position of diagram S2, by the way. Now black's maneuver had me worried. I could see he was intending pawn to b5, and then he'd go knight to b6, hitting one of the rooks, then he'd go knight to c4, hitting my queen. Perhaps this might all lead to nothing, but I thought I'd better get going myself instead, in case the initiative started to slip away. So I moved knight to h2. That's got a mating threat of going knight to g4, bishop takes g7, queen to h6 check, and then knight to f6. You can see from this variation that there was an advantage there for white in leaving his bishop on h6 and delaying the capture on g7, because if I'd played knight to h4 after capturing on g7, black could quite readily play pawn to h5. Well, after white's knight to h2, black took time off from his queenside job to go pawn to f6. White moved knight to g4, and black pawn to b5, pawn to b5. Now switch off again here and see how you would continue for white in this position. There's just enough steam in white's position for him to make progress with direct threats. He played bishop takes g7, black queen takes on g7, Obviously black couldn't take with the king because of queen to h6 check and instant defeat for black. Now after black queen takes g7, white queen to f3. This attack on the f-pawn forces black king out, since the black rook on d8 has got other work to do, guarding the d-pawn. So black moved king to f7. And finally, white doubled with rook on e2 to d2. Now here black had to choose between king to e7, king to e6, or rook to c6. So which one of these would you play? Well, deduct 8 points for either rook to c6, which loses the exchange after knight takes on e5 check, or black king to e6, which is defeated by white knight takes on f6, because if black queen takes on f6, white rook takes on d6 check, and the black queen goes. So, instead of either of these moves, black chose to go king to e7. That's the position in diagram S3. I think it's time to stop the tape again and see what you do for white here. Though black's been pushed around a bit, he's still got his threats. One of them is black pawn to h5 to drive the knight back. The other is knight to b6. So white has to keep up the pressure. He went queen to e3. Black pawn to h5. And now queen to a7 check. I don't know if you'd considered here what would occur if black chose king to f8 here. This seems to put white in a spot, since both his queen and knight are under attack. And if he plays queen takes queen check, then king takes queen will guard the bishop pawn, the pawn on f6. I'd intended to give up a piece after black king to f8 by going queen takes on a6. Then if black plays pawn takes g4, white plays rook takes on d6 with a chainsaw massacre on the 6th rank. Note here that black can't go rook takes rook on d6 because white just plays queen takes rook check on c8. So that means black is very badly tied up. Now, if you moved anything there, the diagram S4 will get you back into the game. In the actual game, black didn't go king to f8, he went rook to d7. White queen takes on a6, black pawn takes on g4, and white queen takes on c8. So far, so good. But now comes the move black had been relying on. He goes knight to b6, forking the queen and the rook. If you hadn't seen that one coming, stop again and work out something in reply. White's final crusher was rook takes on d6. Exploiting the fact that knight takes c8 loses the queen after rook takes on d7 check. So, instead, black had to capture rook takes on d6. And now, if you play queen c7 check, you throw everything away. Instead, just queen to c5. No answer to that one. Black tried knight to c4. White rook takes on d6. black knight takes on d6, white queen to c7 check. And here black can't guard the queen and the knight at the same time, so he has to give one of them up. He went king to f8, queen takes on d6 check, and black was lots of pawns down in a queen and pawn ending, and he resigned very quickly. Thank you. The next game we're going to have a look at is another heavyweight affair from the same tournament. This was a last rounder, and the opponent was David Mabbs, who has a reputation of being a wild player like me. We're both of us are middle-aged at this moment. As frequently happened, both sides conduct a positional campaign on the grounds that the enemy won't feel at home in such situations. So there were no fireworks in this game. I was white and began pawn to g3. Black played pawn to e5, and white bishop to g2. Black pawn to d6. White pawn to d3. Black pawn to g6, and white pawn to c4. So gradually the opening has taken a recognizable shape and name. This is a close Sicilian in reverse. Black moved bishop to g7, white knight to c3, and black pawn to c6. More usual here for black might be knight to c6, but pawn to c6 is very logical in contesting the white's bishop's pressure down the central diagonal. After black pawn to c6, white moved bishop to d2, as in the last game. I was unwilling at this point to commit the kingside pieces to a definite formation as yet, and the bishop is well placed on d2. It guards the knight, and thus makes the queenside advance, pawn to b4, much easier. Also, white's queen may go to c1, and threaten at some point to help an invasion by bishop to h6. So black's next, that was knight to a6. Again logical. The knight may go to c5, or perhaps to c7, where it can support a central advance, pawn to d5. White moved queen to c1, and black bishop to e6. I now began to feel uneasy that black might be getting too much of the centre, since this last move threatens pawn to d5. So I played pawn to f4. f4, f5 turns up in about 95% of my games, which causes people to call it an obsession, which it probably is. In this case, if black occupies with pawn to d5, white can ensure that there will only be one black pawn in the centre, by exchanging on e5. However, at this point, white isn't in a hurry to exchange on e5 himself, because while black still has a pawn on d6, he can recapture with it. And in the first place, that will give him play down the queen file, but more important, it gives him a potential kingside avalanche. He could go pawn to f5, and after that there's always a threat of advancing pawn to f4, which would break up white's position on the king side. After white pawned to f4, black answered well with queen to d7. And now it must be time for you to switch off and have a quiet think on your own. White's continuation was rook to b1. This is quite dangerous. If white can get a pawn down to b5, then he's already chipping away at black's position on the long central diagonal. And that's the diagonal white has his king's bishop on. Black's next was really in the style of Philidor. He moved pawn to f6. He's hoping to fill up the center with pawns, and his f6 pawn gives the e pawn extra support, so he can go pawn to d5. I remember feeling uncertain here that black may have good prospects. Still, I continued pawn to b4, and thought that if black rushed out with pawn to d5, I could play pawn to b5 and invade down the b file with my rook. So black didn't play pawn to d5. He went knight to e7. And white played knight to f3. This is the position of diagram M1. This last move scotched black going pawn to d5 again. For if black does go pawn to d5, white exchanges on e5 and then can bring his knight to g5, white knight to g5, which attacks black's valuable bishop at e6. In view of this, it was quite logical for black to continue here with pawn to h6, but he gave that a miss. He also gave a miss to black bishop to h3, trying to exchange white's bishop. I think I intended something like bishop takes bishop, black queen takes bishop, and then white knight to e4, hitting at d6 and preparing pawn to b5. So what did black play here? He went rook to c8. That reinforces c6. White finally castled, and black did the same. You may wish to switch off here and find a decent move for white. The position is very pretty in some ways. White's pieces are all massed on the wings, and black's are trying to get through in the center. Now white's actual move was queen to a3, after which the pressure was beginning to be felt on black's position. There's a loose pawn at a7 and another semi-weak one on d6. Black answered rook f8 to e8, which gives white the opportunity to try and make concrete gains from the position. I decided against this, I think, because if now white pawn to b5, black pawn takes on b5, then white pawn takes on b5, black knight to c5, white pawn takes on e5. Of course, I can't go queen takes on a7 here because of rook to a8 and knight to c8. So, after white pawn takes on e5, black pawn takes on e5 with the d pawn. I probably thought here the extra pawn to be had here wouldn't be worth the initiative that black would obtain. So, from diagram M2, after black rook to f8, rook fe8, I played a mysterious rook move in reply, rook on f1 to d1. It's always useful to have a rook opposite a queen. It makes the opponent uneasy. Black's reply here was rook on c8 to d8, which I thought erroneous at the time. I pushed forward with pawn to b5. In this case, if Black tries pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, knight to c5, white pawn takes on e5, he can't capture on e5 with his d-pawn anymore, because he's just moved the rook away from the c-file, which would have been guarding the black knight on c5. So he'd have to recapture with the f-pawn, and then white could go knight to g5 to eliminate the bishop at e6. The actual game continued after white pawn to b5 with black knight to c5. Pawn takes on c6, and black recaptured with the knight. He might have wished to recapture with the b-pawn here, but he probably can't afford it. His knight on c5 would find it hard to maintain the outpost, and he'd also be in trouble down the b-file. Now, after black takes on c6, white plays pawn takes pawn, and black f-pawn takes pawn. No alternative there. And now white moved knight to g5, all according to plan. Black pawn to b6, reinforcing the knight at c5, and white knight takes on e6. Naturally, that black didn't recapture the queen here, which would allow bishop to d5. He took back with a knight. I think it's time now to stop the tape again and consider this new position. I think white can claim an edge here. He's got two bishops, both of which have good mobility. Also, black's pawn structure is weakened, and the white squares aren't good for him. There's an outpost for white on d5, whereas black can't count on staying on d4 with a piece, because white would go pawn to e3. Still, black has got chances in this position. He's definitely in control of c5, unless white manages to play pawn to d4 at some time, which doesn't look very likely. Also, there's no ready avenue of entry for white's pieces, the major pieces in particular. The b file has been blocked, and the f file can be contested by black. So let's see how the game went. White played rook to f1, a knight on c6 came to d4. Pawn moved to e3 to eject him. Knight ran back to f5. Now white occupies his outpost, knight into d5. A black knight to c5. White rook to f2. White's building up for a breakthrough on the f-file. Black king to f8. White rook on b1 to f1. At this point, black was feeling naturally insecure about the KB file and decided to get the queens off. A good decision, because after the exchange of queens, white's pawn at d3 will come under fire, which means white will have to backtrack a bit. So black moved queen to a4, queen takes queen, knight takes queen. Now the game enters its third phase, queenless middle game. Now, I moved here bishop to b4 because I was threatened with knight c5. Black played knight c5. and white rook to d1. Bishop on b4 has an X-ray effect on the pawn at d6. That's the intention anyway. And posted there, white can also choose an opportune moment, if it arises, to exchange the bishop for black's knight on c5. I think that Mabs was finding himself short of time here. He was even shorter at the end, and black's solid defensive play begins to loosen from now on. He played rook to f8, and white drove the knight into oblivion. Pawn to g4. Knight to h6. Pawn to h3. It's true the knight may return into play someday, but it'll take him some time. Black moved rook, takes on f2, white king takes rook. Black king to g8. White king to e2. King to f7. I think this maneuver is wrong as well, of bringing the black king into the center. Because of the pawn structure, black's king isn't really safe here. On the other hand, white's king is very cozily placed at e2. Well, how would you continue here for white? Try switching off the cassette and doing a bit of work on your own on the position. White's actual choice, which you may or may not have agreed with, was to play pawn to a4. This attempts to open a line for his rook on the queen side. Naturally, the pawn's untouchable, because white would then go rook to a1. So black moved rook b8, which was a good reply, and it plans to take control of the b file if white opens it by pawn to a5. White's next shot was knight to c3, with another very subtle threat, knight to b5, hitting the a and d pawns. Black king to e6, which guarded d6. Knight to b5, white pawn to a5, sorry, black pawn to a5, and white bishop to a3. At this point, I realized somewhat uneasily that black might even dare to take the a pawn here. Play knight takes on a4. This sort of thing I find nearly always happens when I think I got an opponent cornered. I miss something, and sometimes that means I have to start all over again, or worse. The point is that black has a saving check on c3, forking the king and the rook. For example, if white goes bishop takes on d6, black knight to c3 check, and now white either plays knight takes knight, which allows king takes bishop, or he goes king to d2, which leads to knight takes rook, and then white goes bishop takes rook. The resulting position still looks pretty good for white, though black has got the consolation of having exchanged off some pieces. So I was lucky here. Similar oversights can easily cost a game. As it happens, Mabs didn't play any of this. Perhaps he saw it and didn't think it was good enough, or maybe he didn't have time to see it at all. So if you moved any pieces, you should go back to diagram M3. Mabs actually played bishop to f8. And now he is threatening knight takes a4, because he's guarded d6. So I guarded that by going knight to c3. Black king to d7, white rook to b1. King to c8. I'm not sure where that king is going, actually. And as well as that, it's criminal of black that he didn't bring his knight on h6 back into play. So realizing that, I played bishop to d5, and that stops knight to f7. Black moved bishop to e7. I think it's your chance to take part in this game and make a move. White's move was pawn to d4, after which black's position really disintegrates. I ought to say that this move is very significant, and it is because it's the destruction of the outpost on c5 which spells the end for black, whereas white's corresponding d5 outpost has never been in danger. So let's see how the end of the game went. Black pawn takes on d4, white pawn takes on d4, black bishop to f6, up to his tricks again. Well, white pawn takes knight looks good. I know black would play bishop takes knight, but then white pawn takes pawn. Tremendous past queen's pawn. Still, I didn't play it. I went knight to b5, which guards d4, but allows knight takes a4 by black. And now bishop takes on d6. Tremendous invasion. Black bishop takes on d4, hoping if white plays knight takes on d4, knight to c3 check again. Still, white didn't take. He went king to d3, black bishop to c5, white bishop to f4. Probably noticed here that knight to a7 check was rather good, but a bit ugly. Black moved bishop to f8, guarding the knight, and white rubs it in with rook to e1, at which point I think black must have resigned here, or lost on time. Seems about to lose most of his pieces, excepting perhaps the knight on a4. Side 2. After 2 white games with slow build-ups, we'll go over to the black side and more aggressive play in the opening. This was played in round 2 of the Lara Weekend Tournament, November 1976, and white was Lobo. If you'll reset the pieces, white moved pawn to d4, black pawn to f5. The Dutch defense. One of the few defenses to pawn to d4 that still has a slight homemade feel to it. All the other lines the theoreticians and grandmasters have had a go at and refined everything. But the Dutch has always been neglected, fortunately. In this position, white played pawn to c4 and black pawn to g6. As you can see, I'm not going into the steady Dutch with pawn to e6, probably developing the king's bishop at e7 or b4. This is the Leningrad Dutch, and black's bishop at g7 is definitely more active than on the f8 diagonal. But moving 2 pawns on the king's side so early looks like it's asking for trouble by black. White continued knight to c3, black bishop to g7. Actually, I'm not 100% sure of the first dozen or so moves of this game. I know they were played, but not in the precise order, because I lost the original score sheet. In fact, white has a wide variety of choice, as does black, about how he reaches his ultimate formation. And this is not surprising. Until the armies actually make formal contact, and this is generally signalled by a clash of pawns, there's a certain amount of slack in the position. In this case, white might have chosen to develop his king side before his queen side. The next moves were pawn to g3, black pawn to d6, white bishop to g2, and black pawn to c6. It's generally very common for white to fianchetto against the Dutch, though developing the bishop at d3 can't be bad either. I generally, as a matter of instinct, play my c-pawn up to c6, blocking that attack down the long diagonal. Perhaps if white had developed a bishop at d3, a move such as knight c6 becomes more plausible. Anyway, after black pawn to c6, white moves knight to f3, and black knight to h6. This is the trademark of a line I thought of in 1973 and have been playing ever since. The regular Leningrad has the knight going to f6, which is all right, but it seems very rigid. Black knight to h6 makes the black position very fluid. I'd better expand a bit on the ideas behind knight to h6. Well, in the first place, it's a defensive move. Black has weakened his king side by pawn to f5 and pawn to g6, and particularly the black squares h6 and g5. But if a black knight comes round to f7, the weaknesses are covered. Secondly, the knight at h6 doesn't block the diagonal of the bishop at g7, nor does it as yet block the potential line of the king's rook on f8 after black has castled. A few more ideas. One of black's plans may be to force pawn to e5, and a knight on f7 can clearly support such a thrust. And looking at the white position, we can also see that fianchettoing by white has slightly weakened the squares around his king, h3 and f3. And if white ever tries pawn to e4, then f3 can become very weak, especially if the f-file is opened for a black rook. And what has a black knight on h6 or later f7 got to do with it? Well, it might go to g5 and simultaneously attack both weakened squares, h3 and f3. Those are some of the advantages of bringing the knight to h6. The disadvantages are also there. For example, the knight is hanging a bit on h6, and white, again, might be able to play pawn to e4 much easier, because there's no knight on f6 stopping it, and also pawn to h4 is a small danger. Still, we'll go on with the game now. White castled king's side. White could have tried pawn to h4 here instead of castling, trying to take advantage of the fact that h5 is not guarded by a knight from f6. I expect black could play queen to b6, and then if white pawn to h5, black knight to g4, with play in the center. At any rate, very few people have actually played pawn to h4 against me. So after white's actual move, which was castles kingside, black also castled kingside. Perhaps you'd care to switch off here and study the position a little. Try and decide on a plan for white. White has a number of moves here, but the two main plans are to play pawn to e4, which is most direct, hoping to exploit the black weaknesses down the e file. The other is the restricting move, white pawn to d5. We'll look at pawn to d5 first. So play white pawn to d5. When I first thought of knight to h6, I thought it must be the answer to white pawn to d5. The reason being that black can go pawn to e5 here. And white goes pawn takes pawn en passant. Black bishop takes on e6, hitting the c pawn. White queen to d3. Black knight to f7. Here the knight defends the d6 pawn, which it wouldn't have done if it had been on f6. So white's bishop to f4, which is so strong against the normal Leningrad with black knight to f6, loses a lot of force. But later experience in this position showed that it wasn't all that simple, and the play for both sides, white's down the queen file and black's down the king file, tended to balance out to equality at best for black. So after white pawn to d5, I generally don't play pawn to e5 now. I just go knight to f7, and that knight can perhaps later go to e5. I think that position after black knight to f7 is satisfactory. Now if you'll return to diagram L1, we'll look briefly at the other main idea for white, which is pawn to e4. Perhaps black's best after pawn to e4 is to ignore the thrust and play either knight to f7 or knight to a6. Black has to think twice against capturing himself on e4. It opens up the f-file for him, and it also gives him f5 for a knight, but there are disadvantages in that a white knight comes closer to black's king side, and particularly to black's weak squares on g5 and e6. I think we should go on with the game here, and we'll leave further discussion of this line to a cassette if I ever get round to doing it. Well, from diagram L1, white didn't do either of these things, pawn to e4 or pawn to d5, but played rook to e1. And black chose knight to a6, and white rook to b1. Black's knight to h6. a6 may seem a bit extravagant, now he's got two knights on rook 3. But in view of the situation of the squares, it's the only way to place that knight, because the e6 square has been weakened, and this means that black can bring his knight round to c7 and give the square extra protection. Now, after rook to b1, black played knight to c7, white pawn to b4, and black knight to f7, white pawn to b5. This is a bit over eager, because black now played pawn to c5. It's lucky he had that. If white tries pawn takes c5, black will win a piece by bishop takes on c3. So instead of that, white played pawn to e4. Now take time off here to investigate the position. Switch off. I think the simplest for black here is pawn takes on d4. And then after knight takes on d4, black goes pawn to e5. White knight either goes to f3 or c2, and then black pawn can go to f4. It's a very typical plan for black in this system, intending a pawn avalanche on the king side. Still, I chose a more complex line, which is from diagram L2. And from diagram L2, I played knight to e6. I must have been intending something crazy like white pawn takes f5, black knight takes on d4, white pawn takes on g6, black bishop to g4, white pawn takes on f7 check, and black rook takes on f7. I can't remember how strong white's reply knight takes d4, sacrificing the queen was, and then going in onto e6. But I won't analyze the line further because I don't think it didn't occur in the first place, and secondly, probably unnecessary because, as I mentioned, black had a simpler course of action instead of going knight to e6. So back to diagram L2. After knight to e6, white went bishop to e3, guarding his d4 pawn, and now we got a fourth series of moves. Pawn takes on d4, white knight recaptures pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight. And now pawn to e5, bishop's got to go back to e3, black pawn to f4. This is the same thrust as in the previous note. White can't of course capture the pawn on f4 because the knight on c3 hangs. If you ever intend trying out this variation yourself, then this is a position to aim for, with your pawn coming down to f4, because your kingside preponderance gives you a very good attack. However, because the knight on f7 blocks the rook, sometimes you won't have enough force to play the move pawn to f4, or it will entail a pawn sacrifice. In this case, black was able to take advantage of white's knight being on c3 and unguarded. After black pawn to f4, white retreated bishop to d2. And I'd like you to switch off again and look for black's follow-ups. Well, I played knight to g5 quickly. It looks the right idea, and the knight is straight away striking at white's two weak spots, h3 and f3. Also, white can't really object the piece by pawn to h4 because of pawn takes on g3, followed by knight to h3 check and knight to f2. However, later developments made me not entirely satisfied with this knight move to g5. White replied knight to d5. He's got a nice square there at least. And now, since there's a lot of choice here, see what you would choose for black. I found myself unwilling to play bishop to h3 here, though it is the obvious move. White bishop takes on h3, black knight takes on h3 check, white king to g2. And then what? If you go black pawn to f3 check, white king takes on h3, queen to d7 check, pawn to g4. I doubt if black has got anything for his piece. In some ways too, if you try and exchange white squared bishops, white will be quite happy with the transaction. As long as he can avoid mate, he'll do quite well out of the deal because most of his pawns are on white squares. So, back to the position in diagram L3. The move I actually chose was bishop to e6. And I was a little worried that the advantage might dissipate now if white chose pawn takes on f4. Then if I recapture, it's very unlikely that there's enough compensation for the pawn if white plays bishop takes on f4, because I can't go bishop takes knight because if queen takes bishop is check. So if white goes pawn takes on f4, black can go bishop takes d5. White would then play pawn takes g5. Black would go bishop takes c4. This leads to a rather peculiar position. But if white now plays bishop to e3, or maybe queen to a4 first to guard the a pawn, and then bishop to e3, I'm not sure that black stands that well. So that leads me to the conclusion that black knight to g5 was a hasty move, and black bishop to e6 followed by queen to d7 before knight to g5 was a better choice. Still, all this is hypothetical because white did not spoil the logic of the game by playing pawn takes on f4. So if you'll return to diagram L3, if you moved any pieces, we can continue. Now, so after bishop to e6, by black, white moved bishop to b4. Black queen to d7. Did you see white's threat here? I did, eventually. It was white bishop takes on d6, which he played. If you didn't notice this, stop the tape and try and find a way for black to get out of it. Now if black captures the bishop, knight to f6 check wins his queen. So black chose instead bishop to g4, hitting white's queen. If the white queen moves, say, to d2, black can play queen takes bishop, because knight to f6 check can be answered by queen takes knight. A plausible move for black after bishop to g4 is pawn to f3, but it's very implausible after black plays queen takes d6, white pawn takes on g4, and black pawn to f3, and then the pawn goes to f2, and check and a fork, winning a rook. This means that white's game is suddenly desperate. So after black moved bishop to g4, he lurched forward, knight to e7 check, king to h8, queen to d5, which holds everything for the time being. If you're not too lazy to just press the off switch here, I suggest you try and analyze some possibilities for black. It's the position in diagram L4 if you want to move the pieces around. Well, there's so many good-looking continuations for black, it's hard to choose between them. I'll try and give you a coherent analysis, though it's difficult. I didn't go pawn to f3 here, because though that cramps white, it can also make it difficult to get at him on the king side. For example, it blocks the KB file, and it also blocks the f3 square. A good move for black here was rook f8 to e8. I didn't play it though. Now another strong looking move from the position in L4 is knight to f3 check. White bishop takes knight, black bishop takes bishop. In face of the colossal threat of queen to h3, white's only got rook to b3. And then black pawn takes on g3, and then h pawn takes on g3. And black queen to h3. White rook takes on f3, and black recaptures, winning the exchange. And then white can play bishop takes on e5. Because of this last move, and its recurring theme of white going bishop takes on e5, I decided to stop it altogether. Right, back to diagram L4. Right. Yes, I played rook on a8 to d8, and that will pin the bishop on d6 and mean that these variations are possible. White's reply was forced. He played pawn to c5, and then black chose bishop to f3, not knight to f3 check. Well, bishop to f3 looks better than knight to f3 check. I expected here that white would go rook to b3. When I'd first exchange on g3 with my pawn, and that has to happen now, because if I exchange the bishops first, then white will be able later to recapture with his rook on g3, and that will give him a good defensive chance. So I capture on g3 with the pawn, and then check on h3, and capture on g2 with the bishop, and then check on h3 with the queen, then play knight to f3 check, and finally I'd win the exchange, because you'd have to play rook takes knight without incurring attendant counterplay from black. However, white didn't do any of this at all. He played after bishop to f3. He went knight takes on g6 check. Pawn takes on g6. And bishop takes on f8. After this unexpected blow, I suggest it's time to switch off and have a count of 10. White's got it all worked out. If black plays bishop takes bishop, he can go queen takes e5 check, and he picks up the knight on g5. On the other hand, if black recaptures with the rook, then white will win the black queen. However, black isn't finished. He went knight to h3 check. White king to f1. Black bishop takes g2 check. White king takes g2. Black pawn to f3 check. This is an important intermezzo. If white captures king takes f3, rook takes bishop is check. So white went back king to f1. And now black, after all, was able to play bishop takes on f8. It looks like we're going to get into an endgame, with two pieces against a rook and a rather dangerous-looking c-pawn. However, white actually chose rook on e1 to d1. He couldn't really afford to capture on e5. Black queen takes queen, white rook takes, black rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, bishop takes c5. And I'll stop and have a short think here. The most dangerous move which white could have played, and he didn't, was rook to c1. Then black can't go pawn to b6, because white then goes pawn to a4. And then if black goes knight takes f2, rook takes c5. And king to g7 isn't much good either, because of pawn to a5 threatening rook takes on c5 and then pushing the b pawn through. So, from diagram L5, after white's rook to c1, black could also go bishop to d6, and that looks good as it blockades the white pawn. Still, it isn't good enough either, as white has rook to c8 check, king to g7, white rook to d8, and life's intolerable for black. The best move is bishop to b6, when if rook to c8 check, king to g7, white pawn to d6, king to f7, and the black king gets there in time. As I said though, white didn't choose this. He went rook to e1, thinking that the e pawn would be all his. Unfortunately, all he receives is a fatal kick from the Leningrad knight on h3. Knight takes on f2. Rook takes on e5. Sorry, white didn't play that, because then black would go knight to g4. So, instead of that, white went rook to c1. Black knight to d3. There's not much left in white's position now. Rook to c3, pawn to e4, pawn to a4, pawn to e3. And white resigned. As rook takes knight, fails to pawn to e2 check, king to e1, bishop to b4 check, and queens the e pawn. Well, I seem to have left myself very little time at the end of this cassette, but I'd like to fit in a short example of aggressive play in the opening, also played at the Lara Congress of 1976. This was in round 4 against Emmy Hebden, a young player who seems to be developing well of late. The game began 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to c6. The Caro-Kann, an aggressive, dynamic defense. White moved pawn to d4, black pawn to d5. Now white could go into the new Caro here by knight c3, black captures on e4 and then goes knight to f6, and when white plays knight takes f6 check, he recaptures with the g pawn. That is the subject of a cassette by Ray Keane in the series. An alternative is for white to go pawn takes d5 and then pawn to c4, the Panov. I think there's a game of mine against that, against Inwood in the accompanying literature. Now in this game, white played pawn takes d5, black pawn takes d5, and now bishop to d3. A quiet line, which however has got a good reputation, because white gets play down the e-file, which often gives him good prospects. Black moved knight to c6, white pawn to c3, black pawn to g6, and white bishop to f4. He might like to stop and think about the position. I played my favourite move here, bishop to f5. In the Caro-Kann, black's future should be on the white squares. That's what I think anyway. And this move is a very direct way to try and get control of those squares. Oops. Now white captured, bishop takes f5, black g takes on f5. And so, though black has got doubled pawns, he also has a g file for his rook, and prospects of either going to e4 with a knight someday, or moving a knight round to g6. Now white began to play uncertainly at this point, which is not surprising because he probably didn't know much about the opening. He went knight to e2, black pawn to e6, white knight to d2, black knight to f6. Black's got a very strong grid of pawns in the center. He may have difficulty on the black squares if white tries to float pieces in there, but then again he has got a queen and a bishop which can defend those squares. After black knight to f6, white moved knight to g3, and black bishop to d6. This is another direct move, and trying to contest the f4 square, which I think is a very crucial square in this line. White moved bishop to g5, not sure about that, and black moved rook to g8, white pawn to f4. Perhaps you should switch off here and think about the position a little. Well, here I think black could certainly have exact the exchange with rook takes bishop and then knight to g4. Puts white in a bit of difficulty. However, I chose a different line. I went pawn to h6. And it's now clear that white had mishandled the opening. If he takes on h6 with the bishop, knight goes into g4, white's in trouble. So he had to take. He had to play bishop takes f6, and black recaptured with the queen. And white castled, otherwise, well, he's defending his f-pawn. I moved rook to g4, hoping to get something insipid from white in reply. However, white chose queen to f3. In case you think rook takes f4 wins here for black now, it's not true because white would move knight to h5. Accordingly, after queen to f3, I moved castle's queen side. White knight came to e2, black rook on d8 to g8, white rook to f2, preparing for a massive defense. Now stop the tape and see how you continue as black here. Not sure if what I did was the best. I moved knight to e7. And that's headed for g6 and then either f4 or h4. White moved knight back to f1, another good move by him. He wants to eject the black rook by going knight to e3. Now stop again for black and see what you can see. Here I decided on speculative play. I went knight to g6, white knight to e3, and black rook takes on f4. The plan was that with a fast time limit, a non-stop attack like this might have chance of success. After black rook takes on f4, white played knight takes rook, and black knight takes rook. Knight takes knight, sorry. So black's exchanged down, but white has to be careful with his king. Now white moved king to h1, intending to go pawn to g3 if black plays queen to h4. So first I went knight to d3, and white moved rook to d2. Now queen to h4. Well, I expected white to play knight to f1 here, which wouldn't have been too bad. I'd have replied knight to f4 if he had. But instead, I got a bit of a surprise. White moved pawn to g4. So switch off here and see what you do about that. Well, white was looking very dispirited throughout this game, and he explained afterwards he got depressed at missing pawn to h6. But he was still making it very hard for me, especially with a move like pawn to g4. Trouble is, I can't play pawn takes on g4 myself here, because of queen takes f7. And that square is very tender. It's often a tender square for black in this line. And if it goes here, then I'll not only have the rook on g8 attacked, but also the pawn on e6. So I couldn't do that, and was rather casting around for a reply here. Eventually I hit upon knight to f4. Knight moves back to f4. The idea was, if white now plays pawn takes on f5, which I think is still his best move, black can go knight to h5 with the threat of knight to g3 check. What would white do then? Well, looks obvious he's going to go knight to f1. And then I think knight to g3 check is all black has. Knight takes knight, rook takes. As I worked it out, this position probably tends towards equality when all the pieces have gone. Still, this in fact didn't arise because the effect of the non-stop pressure did begin to tell here, and white started to crack. Now let's replace some of those pieces. Should be a white knight on e3, a black knight on f4, white rook on g8, black pawn on f5, white pawn on g4. White actually played queen to f2, black moved in queen to h3. Now white, in desperation, played queen to g3. That's the blunder we've been waiting for. Now it's very easy for black. He just played pawn takes g4, white queen took on h3, and black knight took on h3. Now black has just got 2 pawns for the exchange, and what's more, those pawns are really going to roll down, and white's rook have no scope. They can't prevent anything. And the rest was white moving to f1 with his rook, black moving pawn to f5, white moved king to g2, black moved pawn to h5, white played knight takes on f5, desperate sack, black recaptured, and white played rook takes. Now over here, black just played pawn to h4 because rook takes d5 is answered by knight to f4 check. I think the game didn't last much longer here. I think white might have gone king to f1, black pawn to g3, black recaptures, white pawn to b3, and black knight to f4. It was something like that, though perhaps not precisely. But it was the fact is that black's pawn got through very quickly, and white resigned around about this point.